Lee, Monterey, and Upper Valley Subbasin Committees of the Salinas Valley Basin Groundwater Sustainability Agency to order. As we have been discussing, Harrison will look through the Subbasin Committee roll and note who is in attendance. And if we do have a quorum, we will announce that in a few minutes. And with that, I will see if there's any general public comment at this point.
I'm not seeing any raised hands, Emily.
Okay.
Oh, never mind. I see Bill Leip.
Okay, go ahead, Bill.
No, I just kind of came in the public access door here. So Harrison, I don't know if you can switch me over to a panelist. Sure. Thanks. That's it. Thanks.
Okay, great. And so we will move into our scheduled items. We are having a workshop today on the water budget and modeling, and I'm going to introduce Abby Ostavar, who's going to introduce Stefan, who will be giving the presentation. I just wanted to note that we did add the PDF of the presentation to the agenda packet earlier today. So if you would like to follow along, you should be able to access that via the agenda packet. It is a detailed presentation, so you may find it handy to be able to refer to that as we go along today. And so with that, I'm happy to introduce Abby Ostavar with Montgomery & Associates.
Emily, as most of you know, I'm with Montgomery & Associates. I'm the program manager for the Salinas Valley. I wanted to take a minute just to put this workshop in context and introduce Stefan Shore. I think this is the first time many of you are seeing him here, but he does quite a bit behind the scenes. He's our senior technical advisor for the Salinas team, and he both coordinates the modeling on this project as well as leading the development of the water budget chapters. So you'll hear from him again as we get to Subbasin Committee meetings and talk more about the water budget chapters. He's been working pretty hard at putting this all together. This workshop is meant mainly to help orient you to what are water budgets, how do you understand them, so that when we get to the Subbasin Committee meetings in March next week, and then the following ones in April, you're able to better understand the water budget chapters. We'll be rolling out the water budgets, starting with some current and historical water budgets this Friday, and then that'll start with a couple subbasins, and the next will follow in the coming weeks, as well as including the future water budgets too. So with this workshop, we'll focus mainly on the water budgets and how the model, give you a high-level overview of the model and how the model is used, or models are used in the water budgets. And then we aren't actually introducing the numbers this time, but at the Subbasin Committee meetings, we'll dive into the numbers and actual water budgets. And then we'll also be holding a workshop on the model itself, the models themselves, in March. So the more detailed modeling questions we'll tackle then. So with that, I'd like to thank Stefan for being here and doing this, and turn it over to you. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Abby. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. So today we're going to talk about the water budgets and modeling. And I'll have to work this slideshow. Okay. So my name is Stefan Shore. I'm a principal hydrogeologist at Montgomery & Associates. And as Abby said, I'm serving as the technical advisor on this project. So I've been kind of behind the scenes, but getting more and more kind of in the front. And Abby is another moderator. She'll be available for some of the high level kind of policy discussions if needed. The objective today is going to be provide a general overview of the water budgets that we're using for the GSPs. So it's a broad. The goals of the watershed is to provide an overview of the general concepts of water budgets, basically what is a water budget. And then we'll start going in and introducing the stakeholders and you all to the complexities of these water budgets for the basin and the tools, the models that we use to develop the water budgets. So a little bit of background first. The California regulations, they require that there's 3 water budgets for the GSPs that represent historical conditions, current conditions, and then projected conditions over the 50-year planning and implementation horizon. And the water budgets have to or must include an inventory of all the inflows and outflows, the supply and demands of the basins, summary of the surface water and groundwater budgets, changes in evaluation of the changes in groundwater storage, evaluation of overdraft if it applies, and then an estimate of sustainable yield. And then also the regulations require that each subbasin must pump within its sustainable yield. So ultimately, that's where we're going. We're going to using these water budgets to help with defining that as a part of that sustainable yield. So first off, just talk about what is a water budget in general. So a water budget is generally an accounting of all the total annual volume of surface water and groundwater entering and leaving an area, and then also the change in the volume of groundwater and storage. So if you think of it in mathematics or simple mathematic terms, it's described as the sum of all the inflows minus the sum of all the outflows equals the change in storage. And so that's the really basic concept that we use for these water budgets. So starting off on a simple, with a simple water budget, here's a diagram from the DWR water budget best management practice. And what we have is you start off with having a control volume. In this case, it's a basin boundary. It's by this black line. And it's that box is the control volume that you're thinking of for a water budget. Then you have these inflows and outflows. The inflows are on the purple or the blue the blue and the blue letters, and then the pink squares are the outflows. And that's all from the total water budget. Well, within the water budget, the volume, there's also exchanges between the surface water and the groundwater system within this area. There's a lot of infiltration, precipitation, groundwater extractions, applied water, recharge, various different things that goes along within a basin. So we're going to go through and, basically the question then is how do we apply this to something more like the Salinas Basin? And here you've been introduced to this slide and the concepts of the watershed, in the watershed workshop back in August of 2020. And so here we have to take a very simplified conceptual idea of water budgets and apply this to a system that has agricultural, municipal, natural native wetland areas. You have rivers going through it. It's a much more complex system. So this is what we're looking at for a water budget for this type of interrelated water budget. And this kind of a diagram, this comes from the California DWR Handbook of Water Budget Development. And I'll go through it actually for the next probably 6 or 7 slides. There's going to be very similar diagrams that all come from this Handbook of Water Budget Development. I just wanted to go and describe the general concepts of each of these ideas. So this describes the flows between the surface water and the groundwater. So if we think of this, there's a gray dashed line on the outside that represents our control volume. That's our water budget area. And then we have 3 different systems that are all within this. We have a land system, which is represented in this green polygon here. We have a surface water system, which is the surface water network, the streams, rivers, canals, the conveyance systems. And then we have the groundwater system, which underlies all of that, which is receiving the recharge that has groundwater inputs, flows from adjacent areas, and that also is used for the extracting the groundwater. So we're going to go back and break this apart. I'm going to, for the next few slides, break this apart and kind of describe each one of these components, because it is very complex. And you'll notice actually on this, before I move on, is the blue, you have an outside control volume, and the blue arrows represent all the inflows, orange on the outflows, and then the green and the purple are showing all the kind of interrelated, where the land surface connects to the surface water system and where land surface connects to the groundwater system and various different things like that. So the land system is basically, it's for the managed lands and native lands that it creates a water demand in a sense for the water budget. And also it's, and it serves kind of passing water between the groundwater system and the surface water system. And this land system can really be divided up further into 3 more systems related to our water budgets here, where you have the urban and agricultural lands, which are more of the managed lands here. And then you have the native or riparian lands, which are kind of, they're slightly related. So that the native lands are really the non-ag, non-urban areas in the watershed. So I'll describe each one of those separately because they all have intricacies that are important for everybody to understand. So the land system, the urban components of the land system, we have the landscape that the water demand is controlled by, dependent on the outdoor and indoor use of urban settings. And so for the outdoor, we have these inflows coming in, and let's start with the precipitation. There's precipitation and there's applied water that can be used for inflows for the urban components. The precipitation falls on the land. Some of that precipitation is used and consumed, lost by evapotranspiration processes, by plants and this soil evaporation on the landscape. Other parts of it would run off into adjacent basins. Others would run off into a return flow into to adjacent streams or into the surface water network if it's not captured into the stormwater first. Then if some of that precipitation that is not lost in that way, in those ways, are infiltrated into the groundwater system and is more of the recharge of the precipitation. For the applied water, then applied water can be groundwater or surface water, but in this case, I think it's mostly groundwater for this basin. That is applied on the outdoor as well, on landscape irrigation and whatnot, and that's lost through evaporation, and some of it could be also kind of either runoff or recharged into the underlying aquifer. But then most of it, the applied water, urban applied water, is used for indoor type uses, and that passes through going on to the wastewater collection systems. Or it could also go into septic systems and have some recharge involved with that. Once it's into the treatment facility, it could be either recharged through percolation basins, or it could be sent out to recycled water for export out of the basin, or it could be into the surface waters, or it can be reused back into the urban setting. So there's a lot of intricacies of just this one component of the land system. The agriculture is another land system component, and I want to point out this diagram shows the furrow irrigation methods, but knowing that the same concepts apply to sprinkler and drip methods that are being used in the Salinas Valley, but it's just really just for a conceptual idea of the water budget component. So what you have here in the agriculture is that you have a water demand created by the crops, and there's going to be inflows for water. For that, we include precipitations, because some of that precipitation does satisfy some of the crop demand. And what's not satisfied by precipitation would need to be met by applied water. And applied water for agricultural systems could be surface water, could be groundwater, or it could be the recycled water like we have for the CSIP area. So that applied water is put onto the fields via some method. That water is lost through the crop demand, the crop ET, or it could be stored in the unsaturated soil that could be used later on for, stored for the crop use later. Or it could be moved past the root zone of the crops and get infiltrated underneath the crop fields. What doesn't get used by the ET and percolation would run off either to an adjacent basin, or run off to through drains or through waste flows back into the surface water system, or it could be reused back onto the agricultural system. So the last land system component we're talking about are the native or riparian components. And so the inflows would be precipitation for all those. And then the outflows would be the evaporation, runoff, and then recharge. Whatever's not evaporated or runoff would be recharged into the underground aquifer. So this is the surface water system. Let's make sure I'm hitting my notes here. So the surface water system, again, this is a generalized system. We have here is basically a surface water network. So you'd have stream flows coming in from upper part of the subbasin or upper part of a basin. It is contributed by reservoir releases that we have in our system. We don't have in our water budgets some of these components like the groundwater exchange losses and gains from the lake between an underlying aquifer. We don't have that specifically into our water budget, but I know that is all taken into account with all the releases and whatnot. But so from when we have the stream flow coming in, we have other inflows that are runoff from adjacent basins. We have imported water coming in. I don't think we have that case going into the surface water system. We have it going into the agricultural system, but not necessarily for this. So the water is coming through, and some of the water that comes in is lost through evaporation along the streams, the surface of the stream itself, open water evaporation. And some of that water in the stream is then diverted out and taking it for surface water deliveries to farms or other types of uses. And there's also a loss, an evaporation loss that occurs along those conveyance systems as well. And also on those conveyance systems are lost just from the potential seepage from at the bottom of those canals and features as well. So, and then ultimately the stream flows out of the subbasin or the area. And in this case, for Salinas, the stream flow out arrow, this is really where the ocean would be in a sense. So it flows out of the Salinas Valley into basin into the ocean. And also a very important component of this is this groundwater gains and loss along the stream. And this is the interaction, the exchange, groundwater, surface water exchange that occurs along streams. And I know that's a very important component of the Salinas Valley water budget. And finally, we'll talk about the groundwater system. Again, these are all images that are from the DWR handbook for water budgets. And here we have, it receives a lot of the water so that it receives the conveyance seepages from the surface water network. It receives the recharge of applied water, precipitation, and any managed aquifer recharge from the land system. It has some of the stream groundwater exchange coming along the streams. It's also, we have subsurface inflows from adjacent subbasins or basins. Then the outflows, we have the big one or main one would be the groundwater extraction, groundwater pumping. And then we have subsurface outflows out of the basin into other adjacent basins. And that's important for when we deal with subbasin by subbasin water budgets. And then one component here that was not in the original DWR slide, but I thought it was really important was this riparian ET loss. And that is also, that's related to the groundwater ecosystem, dependent ecosystems, this riparian systems that have roots that are intersecting the groundwater along streams or in areas that are a direct uptake of groundwater. So I added that arrow into there just because that is an important part of this water budget. And then also change in groundwater storage is, again, it's really an important metric for this water budgets. And that's also kind of a part of this groundwater system. So how do we look at these types of, what kind of tools do we use for developing these water budgets? And for these water budgets, we're using groundwater models that are developed by the USGS. And there's two models that we're using. The Salinas Valley Integrated Hydrologic Model, the SVIHM, will be used for historical conditions. And the Salinas Valley Operational Model, the SVOM, will be used for future conditions. And both models are used by the MCWRA and the Bureau of Reclamation for other studies in the Valley. And currently the models are preliminary, and but both are based on information on surface water flows, groundwater extractions, land use, stratigraphy, layering, and climate change. So overview of the SVIHM. Again, it was developed by the USGS in coordination with Monterey County and the MCWRA. It's a numerical groundwater surface water model. It's constructed using the code ModFlow Ohm version 2. And we'll go more into these details at the next workshop. The model, the SVIHM, includes a focus on the agricultural supply and demand system that uses a flow process module in ModFlow. And then the model simulates the conditions on a monthly basis from water years 1968 to 2017. Again, these will all be a focus of a future watershed, or a future modeling workshop where we'll discuss in a lot more detail the results and how the model was constructed. So the operational model, the SVOM, it's based on the SVIHM in terms of the framework and the processes that are within it. It has an added surface water operations module that helps for simulating the reservoir rules. And it repeats these historical conditions with these reservoir operational rules. So the model doesn't really simulate a 50-year future in the sense, but it rather simulates 50 years of likely hydrologic events that may occur. And this will be used to consider climate change effect on the future water budgets. So we're using DWR climates for 2030 and 2070 climate factors. And we'll talk much more detail in the future modeling workshops about the workings of this model. So this is a lot on this slide. So this shows the hydrogeologic hydrostratigraphy of the model, and this shows that the SVIHM and the SVOM were trying to honor the hydrostratigraphy in the known aquifer units that we have in the valley. And what we have here are a number of plots. On the left, we have a plot that shows the basin model thickness, and we have two cross sections, a transverse cross section and a longitudinal cross section up the axis of the basin. The thicknesses, you'll see that it's thicker down in the northern end, and generally thins out when you get up towards the upper valley areas. So on the transverse cross section, we can show here, let me back up first. Let me show you this table. The table is what we use internally to kind of track where these models are representing, what the model layers are representing. And here, so there's 9 layers in this model. The first layer is for the shallow sediments and the dune sands. The second is Salinas Valley aquitard. Layer 3 is the 180-foot aquifer. Layer 4 is the 400-foot aquitard. Layer 5 is a 400 aquifer. Layer 6 is the 400-foot deep aquitard. And layers 7 and 8 are the deep aquifers. And layer 9 is the underlying Monterey and granitic basement flows.
Is the term traverse or transverse?
It's probably transverse. Oh, yep, yeah. I misspelled that, or we misspelled it on there. It's transverse. Yeah, sorry.
No, I just want to make sure it's right.
It's transverse. It's
My mic.
transverse. Just the short end of the valley.
Thank you.
So when you look at those cross sections, then you can see that like the deep aquifer is represented by these blue layers. Then the 400-foot aquifer is this darker yellow wedge in between. Then we have another aquitard in the orange, and then the 100-foot aquifer is this lighter orange. And then the Salinas Valley aquitard is in brown, and the shallow sediments are atop on the yellow. So that goes through basically through the Monterey seaside basins up through east side, the 180, 400-foot basin, and then the east side subbasin as well. Then the longitudinal cross section goes up the axis, and it's the same type of colorings. You can see the layerings here with the aquifers and the aquitards. So this shows that the land use data that was incorporated in the SVIHM and it comes from Monterey County. The left is a more generalized mapping of the land use, and then the right is a more zoomed in. This happens to be for the 4-bay subbasin, but it shows the more detailed land use information that the model relies on for various aspects of water demand and other components of the farm process. So the data sources that go into these models, some of the data are measured directly and are incorporated in the model, including precipitation, stream flow, surface water diversions, groundwater pumping. And the models are used to also estimate parameters that are not easily measured. Things like evapotranspiration, recharge, surface water, groundwater exchange, and a change in the groundwater storage. So the model was calibrated to historical measurements, including groundwater levels and stream flows. And what that means is that they construct the model, USGS constructed the model using the various different data that were available, and ran the model and would make adjustments until it would match within a reasonable level or match the measurements of groundwater levels and stream flows at those various locations. So the current status of these models. The SBVB GSA has received a preliminary evaluation copy of the SVI-IHM, and we're evaluating that model output as a guide for estimating the historical water budgets and the current water budgets. And the MCWRA has received a preliminary evaluation copy of the SVOM and is running the simulations for the SVB GSA. Both models will be made public after the USGS finishes its internal review. And the water budgets that are being developed by these models are preliminary and are subject to change in the future. So using the models for the Salinas Valley water budgets. So how were they used? So this map shows the model area for the SVIHM, or both models. This is the model domain in the red square or the rectangle. The areas that are colored polygons, those are the active areas within the model domain. That is where the groundwater is simulated within the models. The dark areas, as the note indicates, the dark areas are areas that are within this groundwater base or within the model, but they're outside of the regulated, the GSA subbasins. But they are within the model, and we take that into account on these water budgets, and we're only doing water budgets for within the boundaries of the designated subbasins. So here we have the and then everywhere outside of that, of these colored polygons, are inactive cells within the model. So the model is a big rectangle, but only a portion of that, the center portion of here, it is actually active within the model.
Stefan, sorry to interrupt. I see a raised hand. Do you want to take questions now, or?
We can. I mean, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just really a clarification.
Yeah.
This is Bill Leip. So we did a basin modification to the Upper Valley, which extended what was considered the Upper Valley, at least based on Zone 2C and prior definitions. It was extended all the way down to the county line down there. Does the model include all of that area, basically south of San Ardo and Bradley?
Yes, so on this map, I'm not quite sure where those San Ardo and Bradley are, but
it's basically down towards the bottom where it begins to pinch. There's a little green island in there. It's right around there is where I believe it had cut off.
Yeah, so the model includes all the way down to the county line. So all the purple area here, so it would include the San Ardo area.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So what we have, there's 7 subbasins in the Monterey County, as you all know, and the seaside is the adjudicated. And so we are using these, the model is set up with various different zones, and the water budgets are developed for each one of these zones, and the zones are representing the subbasin boundaries. So we are developing a water budget for each one of these subbasins.
Stefan, looks like we have another question.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm missing those. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
This is Bob Jakes with the Seaside Basin Watermaster. I sat in on a number of meetings the Water Resources Agency held during the initial portion of development for the Salinas Valley Integrated Hydrogeologic Model. And if I understood or recall correctly, they were not going to include the Seaside Basin in the model because the Seaside Basin already has its own model, and the decision was made for whatever reason, I don't exactly recall, to not overlap into another area that already has a model, because there could be conflicts between the output of the two models and those would have to be dealt with and so forth. It looks like from your slide here that it is going to include the Seaside Basin, and I'm wondering how the coordination between the Salinas Valley model and the Seaside Basin model is going to occur.
That's a good question. Yeah, it is. It does appear to be in the model, and we would have to address that issue of how those two models would be working together. That is something that we are looking into.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
We can set up a meeting down the road to discuss this as well.
it's an important issue. You're absolutely right. It is an important issue and we are aware of that. And right now we're trying to evaluate that.
Okay, and I guess also you probably have somebody in the participants or attendees list from Marina Coast Water District, but as I understand it, they're going to develop their own model for the Monterey subbasin as well. So I guess that would be the same type of issue there.
Yeah, and we're working with them very closely.
Yes.
So we're planning to, we're starting the process. So.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, that's a good point.
I saw Howard raise his hand there. He
Okay.
may have some comment to add.
You should be able to talk now.
Thank you. Howard Franklin, senior hydrologist. And so the model was originally developed for the county's basin investigation. So it did need to include the entire basin, but Mr. Jakes is right. There was no intention to model the seaside area, although we had to do for continuity of flow along the boundary, we did have to do some model configuration in that area, but it was minimal. And there's never been an intention to develop a water budget from the seaside basin portion of this model.
Good clarification. Yeah, thanks, Howard.
And Stefan, just one more note. Just want to let everyone know that the East Side Monterey and Upper Valley committees have a quorum. So letting the committee members know. I don't see any other questions for the moment.
Great, thank you. Okay, so talk a little bit more back into the water budgets for Salinas Valley. So go through the components of the surface water budget that we have. And a lot of this will be a repeating of some of the concepts that we've already talked about, but again, we're kind of zooming in on more details. What we're showing here on the right here is a watershed map. This is just showing for the Salinas River watershed in the pink here. There are other watersheds like for Langley, for example, up here that are included in the model. This figure is just not showing it, but that does include this surface water drainage in the watershed for Langley and other over at the Monterey as well. So we have here is this precipitation would fall along this watershed and flows into the groundwater basin, which is this center kind of tan area on this figure. And so the model, the SVIHM has a way of routing this water. It has another model, a watershed model associated with routing this precipitation down into the streams of the groundwater basin. So that's the whole area of the surface water budget. Other inflows that we have are Salinas River coming in from the south. We have reservoir releases coming in onto the tributaries. We have runoff, like I was just mentioning, the runoff from the surrounding watersheds down Arroyo Seco and other major drainages along the sides of the groundwater basin. We have return flows that happen along the conveyance system, and I'll show a diagram about that. That's basically return flows from excess ag water and things like that. And then we have inflows from the groundwater. That is the gaining portions of streams. We have outflows, which is the Salinas River out, and in a total sense, it's out into the ocean. But we also do the total ins and outs per each subbasin as well. Other outflows include diversions, and we have 2 diversions in the model, and that's the SRDF and the Clark County colony up here on the Arroyo Seco. And then the last outflow is groundwater, it's to the groundwater, meaning it's the river water that seeps into the channel surface and into the groundwater. So this is what the surface water network in the SVIHM looks like on these blue lines in this diagram. And we have the major river of the Salinas is in this dark blue line here. And then we have a lot of the tributaries coming in as well. And this is just a water budget for accounting for the inflows and outflows across each subbasin. So I was just mentioning that before, that we have, let's just use Fort Bay here in the pink. It would have all these inflows of surface water coming into this polygon. And then we have total up all the outflows going out of this polygon as well, would be the surface flow out.
Well, why are the San Antonio rivers and Nacimiento rivers highlighted in heavy blue?
That's probably, I guess it was just it was a symbology thing for a map that I took this from. That is symbolizing the major drainages.
You might want to make the Arroyo Seco a major contributor there, because it's right there into the forebay. It's
absolutely. I guess I didn't mean that. It's probably meaning.
I think it's the second most major tributary in the valley.
Sure. I think also it's related to when we process these results to know what the conservation releases are, and those are related to those streams connected to those reservoirs. So that's probably why we had that symbolized as.
No, I appreciate it. I've been in meetings with blue lines before, and I just want to clarify. That's all. Thanks.
Nope. Yeah, good. So the figure here shows, it's again, it's from the DWR handbook of developing water budgets, and this illustrates what each of these little segments, what the model can do for each one of these little segments along these blue lines. And so the model helps track the water that's coming inflow, the inflow of the water from the upstream areas. It tracks what's coming in from runoff or from contributing tributaries or canals. It tracks water lost through evaporation of the surface of the open water. And it also diverts, if there's any diversion along it, and the model will divert it at the appropriate location and volume. And then also what the model does, and it's really important for this particular water budget because it's not easily measured, is that it gives us an estimate of groundwater exchange between the surface water and the underlying aquifer. So it's that groundwater loss or gains along the stream. So that's really an important function of the numerical groundwater model. So for the groundwater budget, it's very similar to the surface water budget in the sense of we have an accounting of all the inflows and outflows within a certain subbasin. And in this case, again, with Fort Bay, we have the groundwater coming in from Upper Valley and groundwater moving out towards to the east side in the 180-400 foot subbasins. So we have the inflows being those groundwaters flowing in. We have recharge in this case, all the recharge is coming in through the streams along the stream network, seepage along streams and under agricultural fields. And also we have an inflow from the surface water, and that's the seepage from the surface water into the groundwater. So that's the kind of the loss of stream flows. And the outflows are the subsurface groundwater flows to the adjacent subbasins, groundwater extraction or pumping, evapotranspiration. That's where again the riparian roots are intersecting the groundwater table and are directly taking groundwater, and then outflow from the surface water from the groundwater to the surface water, and that's where basically where the streams are gaining. That would be an outflow from the groundwater budget. Here, this just shows the representation, the locations of groundwater pumping wells. And these are both urban and agricultural. And these dots represents the well grid cell center that is simulated in the model. So they're not necessarily the exact locations of these wells, but they're generally in the right location within the grid cell of where they are located in reality. And these are all, they're color coded by basically by the land use or by the farm ID that is being used to drive the farm process. So other components of the groundwater budget, really we need the model to estimate a lot of the components that we're using for the water budgets, including the surface water groundwater exchange, riparian ET, evapotranspiration, conveyance seepages, recharge, subsurface inflows and outflows, and then storage changes. So water budget results. Here we're currently processing the results of the model, and the historical conditions for water budgets right now is set at water year 1968 through 2017, with the current conditions being water year 2017. And these results will be presented by subbasin at future subbasin committee meetings. But just for an example, here is two plots that we've already submitted for the 18400 aquifer subbasin GSP back in, I think, 2020. And these plots are showing the surface water budget and the groundwater budget. And they show each color has is represented by a component of that particular water budget. And so really what this just shows is that we're tracking annual variations within each of these components throughout the total model period for both the surface water and the groundwater budget. So we produce these type of plots to help evaluate and assess the trends that we might be seeing in the water budgets. What's missing from this groundwater plot that we will be including in others is a annual change in storage or a cumulative change in storage plot as well that helps us track that through time. So for the future water budgets, this will incorporate the climate change conditions for 2030 and 2070 in accordance with the guidance by the DWR. And these results are currently processed, so I don't have any results to show at this point, but we will be talking those in detail in future meetings and workshops. So really what this, one part that comes down to is the water budgets is to helping describe what sustainable yield is. And so what is sustainable yield? It's the estimate of the quantity of groundwater that can be pumped on a long-term average basis without causing undesirable results. And that's not something we're going to be talking to in any more detail today, but we just wanted to introduce this concept because to show that connection of the water budgets to the sustainable yield concept, which is a lot more complex and more detailed and involves other decisions other than just the watershed or water budget numbers. And that's what we have today. That wraps up the presentation. Is there any questions?
So I see committee member Breen and Lipe.
Hi, this is Patrick Breen, Marine and Coast Water. I had a question regarding the seawater intrusion and how it's calculated in the water budgeting process. And I was wondering if you could maybe expand on how it relates to the level of storage. And then also, I know you don't want to go into the sustainable yield, but it seems like it would be a negative in that balance. And so I see it on the positive side of the water balance diagram. So I was wondering if you could just kind of expand on how the seawater intrusions dealt with within the model.
Yeah, we'll go into a lot more detail in future. We can show you how we're doing that, but it's basically the way we're estimating it using this model, because this model does not include specific simulation of seawater intrusion. So we are estimating it by quantifying the flux that's coming in from the ocean into the subbasins. And so that's what we're considering to be seawater intrusion, is just that flux of that simulated groundwater movement into the basin from the ocean. And then you're right, that information is used for the sustainable yield, and it is subtracted from the available storage in a sense of that would be used to calculate that sustainable yield.
Thank you.
You also have Bill Light.
Bill.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the presentation. In your overview, you presented some concepts that were interesting to me because it just had some questions about them. And if one of the experts wants to jump on and who might know, that would be great. But what percentage of the irrigated acres in the Salinas Valley are irrigated with surface water? Does anybody know? Because I'm sure there's some, but I mean, when I say surface water, I mean truly a surface water diversion on the river. Crickets is okay if nobody wants to.
I don't have an answer for that myself, but
it was presented in there as sort of a concept. As it's just kind of, I'm not sure how big it is.
Bill, Bill, this is Derek. Hi.
Yeah.
We
Hey,
know
Derek.
the diversion amounts, at least what's reported as a diversion. Now, again, there's this issue that some water is reported as a diversion. and reported as pumping. Did you
I'm
know
talking
that?
about actually having a contraption in the river that actually diverts the water, not
Yeah.
someone who has a well near the river that says, hey, just in case, I'm going to file a report.
But we don't have the acreage that goes to.
Okay, that's
So
fine.
We don't have that connection. For you.
And then I was interested in the overhead precipitation illustration because, and I'll just speak for kind of the Upper Valley, but I'm sure it applies pretty much everywhere else. A large portion of of the recharge in the Upper Valley doesn't come from the rain that actually falls over the land. It's what happens in the Big Sur watershed, and then that water, for millions of years before the reservoirs were built, flowed, and that was a cycle. And so I just wanted to bring that up because people, you see a picture of rain overhead and it's like, oh yeah, that's how the water gets in the ground, and in a lot of cases, it's, at least in our valley, that's not how it works. And then runoff. There was another thing in the overview of the sort of the holistic view of the water cycle. Runoff is something that doesn't, and I think this is true for most of the valley. Runoff pretty much, you might run off your field, it might run out even off your ranch, but more than likely it's going to go back into the ground before it ever gets close to truly running off into the ocean. So I just wanted to just highlight that for folks in case they were interested. And then you said the models will be reviewed at some point. I know that the historical model has been waiting for the USGS to finish their very deliberate and thankfully making sure that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed before and with their quality assurance process. But the operational model will also be available once the USGS gives its okay.
Yes.
Both models?
Yeah, both models will be available. Yep.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
You also have Janet Brennan.
Okay. Janet?
Hear me?
Yes.
During development of the 18400 plan, there were serious questions raised about the assumptions regarding climate change. And the response was the model is using the USGS assumptions, but those assumptions are not particularly accurate. Has USGS updated its climate change assumptions?
That I'm not sure of. Abby, do you have something?
Well, just to jump in, it's not the USGS assumption. So we use the DWR, the Department of Water Resources, climate change assumptions for 2030 and 2070.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Next, I see Norm Groot has his hand raised.
Yes, hi, good afternoon, and thank you for the presentation. My question relates to the groundwater ecosystems and the connection to groundwater and evapotranspiration. I'm just wondering if there's a separate element that we need to consider of the surface water evapotranspiration for the vegetation or riparian areas in the Salinas River, because in the past we've heard wild estimates of how much surface water is really going into that vegetation, anywhere from 20,000 to 50,000 acre feet a year. And I'm just wondering if the surface water element of that is also being considered here when we look at water budgets.
That's a really complex issue. You know, the riparian vegetation, you bring up a really good point. And so this model, I believe it's the groundwater is the way they're dealing with the riparian vegetation. But that is a complicated issue to tease out of models. But we are thinking of ways to be able to address that.
Okay, I'll accept that as an answer for now, but I think at some point in time, it's going to have to be addressed, because we do have a lot of exotic vegetation that has been proven to use surface water rather than groundwater in those ecosystems.
Yep.
Thank you.
That's a really good point. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
Next, we have phone number ending in 6201. Press *6 to unmute yourself.
Hi, Harrison. It's Steve McIntyre. I got out in the attendees. But my question is, and this might be a little bit too granular, but did you consider the efficiency or relative irrigation method efficiency in the model, specifically, you know, knowing that drip irrigation is generally considered 85% efficient, where sprinkler might be in the 70s or low 70s. And then, of course, I don't think there's a lot of furrow irrigation going on anymore, but it is something to be considered. Was that looked at in the modeling as well?
We'll go into a lot more detail of that once we know exactly more about those kind of assumptions, but that would be part of the farm process. But we can go into a lot more detail. That the next workshop is probably a more appropriate way to talk about that, where we'll really go into the details of that type of question.
And Steve, this
Thank
is
you.
Derek Williams. Thanks for bringing up this question, because as you are aware, we did not build the model, but by you bringing up these questions, you're teeing up questions that we need to answer at the next workshop. So if you have questions like this, please do tee them up so we can make sure we burrow into the right corners of the model and are able to answer these at the next workshop.
Yeah.
Great, Derek. Thank you.
And I'll just note the 4Bay committee also has quorum as well. Next question is phone number 0312. Press *6 and unmute yourself.
Hi, yes, good afternoon. I'm Margaret Ann Coppernoll, the Monterey Subbasin. First, I'd like to thank you for a wonderful, very informative presentation. A couple of the other members already asked areas of questions that I had on climate change and seawater intrusion. I was just curious if you were going to be able to calculate or include all the development or construction of seawater intrusion barriers into the budget workshops.
We are developing those type of projects, the scenarios now for seawater intrusion and various different projects. So I think that's probably something that that in the future meetings we talk about more, but I know that is part of the discussion of projects for using the model to answer those type of questions.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Just to add on to that, our top priority was getting the water budgets done. The projects and management actions aren't actually in the water budget itself, but we will be doing model simulations for them so we can look at them in comparison. So it's kind of the next phase that we'll be doing.
All right, next we have John Farrow. John, I've asked you to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
I have two related questions. The first one is, as I understand the difference between the historic and the future model is that the future one involves the ability to manipulate the reservoir operations components. And I'm wondering whether it's intended that one or the other of the models be used to historically assess the differential benefits to the subbasins of reservoir operations, which is an issue that could be relevant in connection with, for example, allocation of costs among the basins for projects and doing things like engineers' reports.
That question may be more appropriate for, yeah.
Maybe Howard or the Water Resource Agency can answer that a little bit better than myself or us.
Well, let me ask the follow-up question then, if somebody can address it. The follow-up question is, I assume that because it appears that the model itself will work regardless whether the basin boundaries are drawn correctly or not. For example, it appears to be a matter of indifference whether you include or exclude the seaside basin. The model could work, and there are areas in the model that are connected but are treated as givens passively rather than actively interpreted in some way. So I'm just wondering whether the model itself is going to be used to determine what areas actually do benefit from management actions.
Abby?
So we will be able to look at benefits. We are not doing a benefits assessment as would be done to divide up financing of a project. But we will be able to tell what the benefit of a project is to a specific subbasin divided along the zones. So,
and also to determine the extent of the benefited area in that subbasin. For example, there is a long-standing question about whether upgradient subbasins like Langley and Corral de Tierra actually receive benefits from projects intended to maintain groundwater levels in the valley, since they are so much higher. Will the model be amenable to answering questions like that?
Yeah, I think we can once we simulate a certain project with different stresses and features, and then we can evaluate the model as a whole. So we would be able to evaluate how water levels are changed or whatnot in the adjacent or other subbasins. So we should be able to evaluate those types of questions.
Thank you.
And I did allow Howard Franklin, the Water Resource Agencies, to speak.
Yeah, I think Stefan addressed the question really well. Thank you.
Next question is from Nancy Isaacson.
Thank you. Nancy Isaacson for Salinas Valley Water Coalition. Just a couple questions. When you say long-term,
Oh, I think I might have gotten muted, Nancy.
am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, question. When you talk about the sustainable yields, really your last slide, you say there'll be an estimate of the groundwater that can be pumped over a long-term average annual basis. Is that long-term, is that calculated on the 50-year, or do you do increments? And then part of the compound question is, as you're looking at that in the long term, are you updating and reevaluating your land use segment, or is your land use and some of your different pumping scenarios, including the reservoir operations, remain stagnant?
So Abby, did you want to? So there's different sustainable yields that we will be presenting in this water budget chapters. So it'd be a kind of a historical sustainable yield based on the average, the period that represents the historical water budget period. And then there will be the future sustainable yields, which would be based on those, the 50-year planning horizon numbers for the 2030, 2070 numbers. As far as land use goes, that's a bigger question, I think. Right now, the land use is set for the future is set at the 2014 land use, and that uses that simulated forward for those 50 years. I'm not quite sure about what might be happening with changing that land use in the future, but conceivably it could be done. But right now, it's staying as 2014.
Did that answer your question, Ms. Isaacson, there?
I'm pondering that whether
Okay.
it did or not.
I can
Because-
tell.
Yeah, because it didn't,
Well, go ahead, try
it
what
didn't
you're
address
not-
the pumping part. It didn't address the hydrological part.
Sorry, repeat that then. Sorry, I missed that part of it. What was that?
Well, you said the land use changed, but then there's the other component as to the reservoir operations and, you know, some of the inputs into your hydrologic model. Are you looking at that changing, or is that going to remain just like your land use is at 2014? Do you anticipate, are you looking then at the reservoir releases being continue to be operated the way they are today for as you project forward for the 50 years?
Yeah, Nancy, I'll take that. Stefan, I'll take that. The operating rules for the reservoir stay the same. So if the rule is we need a certain fish flow on a certain day, those rules are the same all the way through the future. We vary the rainfall, we vary the hydrology every year in our simulations. So there's variable rainfall, variable evapotranspiration, but the reservoir rules stay the same and they respond to that. So if we simulate a drought in the future, whatever the reservoir rules are for a drought, those are incorporated into our future simulation. Did I get closer to answering your question?
No, that's perfect, actually. I'm nodding my head. I know you can see that, but I'm nodding my head. Yes, thank you very much. Because that does. And so the operating rules will stay the same unless and until there's something that the agency does that's different.
And we absolutely, and we can incorporate new rules as projects. We can say the reservoir rules right now are set to stay the same. And if one of our management actions is we need to change those rules, then we can compare what would changed rules look like compared to just keeping the rules we have now.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Next, I see Thomas Versick has a question.
Thank you, Tom Versick here. This is very helpful. And Ms. Isaacson's questions and all the follow-up actually took care of most of what I was going to ask. And what I understand, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but what I understand is for the future water budget and therefore the future sustainable yield, at least you start with static reservoir operation rules and you use a static 2014 land use. That's what I'm understanding from the discussion. Obviously, you can run scenarios that vary that. So I don't really need to ask a question about that, but instead I'll make the point is that could be a collision with the dormant lands. And I point to specifically the Upper Valley, and there was a graphic you had, I don't remember the slide, but there was a whole bunch of dots showing water use. And when you got to the south, there was a lot of empty land because there's not a lot of water use. And there will be changes. I don't know what they will be, but there will be changes in land use. And I'm going to make a point I've made in other places, and it's not for the modeling, it's not for the modelers per se, but it's for the policy people, is that if the GSP, after you do the models, after you do the sustainable yield, after you do all the other chapters, does not leave room for the dormant lands to be developed, then the planning agencies will not be allowed to develop them. So it is super critical that policy-wise, something is done. And presumably that'll have impact on modeling and sustainable yields and other things, but that's beyond my level of expertise at the moment. But I just point that out, and I thank the discussion from Mr. Isaacson and everyone who was responding to that, that really does clarify those points, at least from my perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. And we have talked about pumping allocations in some of the sub-basin meetings, and it is something that we could do some sort of model run, you know, involving pumping allocations. We haven't gotten there to that point, but we are talking about doing those things and looking at, you know, those land use changes, you know, in whatever approach the sub-basins take.
All right, next I see Committee Member Smith.
Thank you for the presentation. I guess maybe some comments, or, you know, we paid into this USGS modeling, or the modeling that you guys are using. So I guess that isn't final, and frankly we're all frustrated, right? You guys are frustrated. We as landowners and users and payers are frustrated. And because here we are trying to make, you know, that we're mandated by law to make these plans without the critical information that we need to actually make those. And so as I'm hoping, as you've said, that we're actually going to get something, some whatever concrete data, which I've understood now in a few years of doing this, that it's, you know, this whole process is like somewhat like weather modeling. We're doing the best we can with what we have. So I guess my question is to everyone that is skeptical of, we want to use the science, but then we don't have the science, you know, how are you guys going to be able to answer the questions to us without USGS putting a stamp on it? And even when they do, whenever the hell that is, what does that mean? So I guess that's one question. Did that make any sense?
It made sense to me. I was, maybe Derek or somebody else might, but I don't really know the response on that.
Yeah, Jason, so this is Derek again. So are you asking about sort of a confidence, or, I mean, we're going to have the best information we can get, and we know there's going to be uncertainty in it, and we know we're going to be improving this as we go forward. So I'm not sure if you're asking for, can we quantify the confidence, or just do you want me to look more confident while I'm on the video? And I'm not sure. Yeah.
Well, so I guess this goes back to John Farrow's question, right? You know, we're getting unrelated but related, right? We're dealing with how we're going to divvy up a 218 project over on the water resources side, and we're using a 1998 model because there is no official model
right
now. But you guys are using the model, and of course Water Resources has the same ability that you guys do. It just, right, having the two different agencies that have two different jobs to do but have to work together. And I guess I bring this up in this forum where we have 60 some odd people in here. How and when do we get to the point where USGS puts a stamp on this, and we can move forward and say we're now using this model, and we don't have everyone coming back at us saying, well, this wasn't approved, or this isn't official?
No, good question there, Jason. And the goal, it's not just the goal, it is, you know, in the plan here, is that ourselves, Water Resource Agency, Bureau of Reclamation, everybody will be using the same model once it gets released by the USGS. So that is where we're headed. We, as the GSA, are in a time crunch to release the GSPs. And because our time crunch is shorter than some other projects, we are being forced to use this preliminary model and take some information out of it. In my preference would be we aren't under this time crunch. We do wait until USGS releases the model. Everybody has the same model at the same time and moves forward. Because we're in this time crunch, we have been put in an awkward situation of using this model. I think the best we can do as your GSA is to be honest with you when we're presenting data from this preliminary model and say, this is preliminary. We have some concerns about A, B, and C in it as we understand those, and say, those are things that when we look at it, those might not be the best numbers. We have some concerns about it, but we have to move forward with it to get this report out. And we are planning on changing this in the future. It's not a satisfying answer, Mr. Smith. It is, though, the explanation of why we're in this position where we're using this model, and the Water Resource Agency can maybe wait a few more months before they have to use it.
So a follow-up to that, and thank you, then is, and this is really just understanding what we're doing with Sigma and putting these plans together, is in this project, putting together these plans, as well as what we're doing with the Water Resources Agency in voting for possible things that we need to do. My question, and of course, maybe some of the lawyers out here can help answer this or whatever, but my understanding this whole time is we're putting together a plan with the best knowledge that we have with what's currently there. And so that the idea then is, of course, as we get smarter and get more information and whatever, we will be able to adjust the plan. So when questions come up like future land use, that we have no idea what that'll be other than the stuff that isn't currently being used and will it, what are we specifically pigeonholed into when we turn this plan in? Because my understanding, the way I've described it all along, is this is the best plan that we're putting together to try to reach sustainability, and it'll be adjusted because things are going to change. But am I wrong? Am I wrong that if we put something in here that says we're going to do this, that now that's it, and we're being held to whatever's there?
No, you are not wrong, Mr. Smith. We are turning in this plan. It is demonstrating that this valley has a commitment to getting to sustainability, and it defines what sustainability looks like for us and our first cut at how we get there. We are not held to, for example, we're not held to any project that we put in there. If we put in a project and say we want to do this, and it turns out there's an alternative project, it turns out we don't need to implement it, we are not held to that. If we even decide what our definition of sustainability is, our SMCs, our sustainable management criteria, we say we want to change those, we can even do that. It's a little longer process because we have to make sure that there's a lot of public input on it there. But you are absolutely right that we are saying this is our best estimate today, and as we get better data, we can absolutely change the things that are in our plan, as long as we demonstrate that by 2042 or 2040 for the 180, we are going to get to a sustainable condition. And that's really the line in the sand that we have to get to there. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, I see Committee Member Light.
Yeah, I didn't know if there were folks from the public. I don't know if you seem to be mixing, so I didn't want to step on anybody if there were public members ahead of me. Harrison, I don't know if you.
Yeah, I'll go ahead with.
Let the public ask some questions because you can come back to me. Thanks.
Okay. Then next we have Bill Stevens. Bill, I've asked you to unmute. It looks like you're unmuted, so you should be able to talk now if you're there. All right, we'll come back to you, Bill. Marika Desmond.
Thanks, Stefan. I just wondered, I've heard some conversations about surface water outflows that might be pumped in the valley and used elsewhere. And I just wondered, how is that groundwater measured in the surface water outflows calculation? Is there a way that that's measured, and would just be curious to know. Thank you.
Ms. Desmond, I'm sorry, would you clarify that? I'm not sure what the question is as far as surface water outflows that are measured in the groundwater.
Right, so if groundwater is pumped out of the valley but used outside of the valley, I'm wondering how that might be measured in surface water outflows calculations or otherwise accounted for in the model.
Oh, okay, good question there. If groundwater is pumped out of the valley and used somewhere else,
Derek, who's pumping water out of the valley? Do you know?
I'm not going to enter this conversation, Mr. Leib. I'm going to be quite cautious about this one.
I think there would be a few folks that would be interested in that.
Yeah. All I will say is in the model, what happens is all the groundwater pumping is accounted for, and then it is put somewhere. So if you pump groundwater and then you put it back on your land for irrigation, the model says, let's pump this much water. And then in a second effort, it says, now let's put it on the land. If water is taken out of the valley, the model says, let's pump that water. And then the model doesn't say anything else. It just says, let's pump that water, because there's nowhere else in the valley for it to go. So it shows up in the model as just water that's been pumped and seems to have disappeared there, because that second action, let's do something with that water, never happened. Did that answer your question, Ms. Desmond?
Yes, so it shows up as water that's been pumped, but because there's no application of it inside the model area, you don't see it on the other end.
You don't see it on the other end. It goes away. Yes.
Thank you.
I'm sure that's not happening. Okay.
We'll go back to Bill Stevens. All right, I've asked you to unmute. We're still not hearing you. Maybe if you have a microphone plugged in, you want to unplug that, replug it in. Sometimes just as simple as leaving the Zoom and coming back in can fix audio issues. But we will come back to you.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Harrison, for managing that. I just want to make sure folks.
Yeah.
The karaoke, you want to be sure that everybody's getting their fair shot at the mic there. I wonder, a question about dormant lands was brought up, and Jason, I think committee member Smith asked a really good question about, and this has to do with land use. I know it's been asked about before about, how firmly locked in, because we're doing all this and we know, well, yeah, things may change, but in 10 years, people may say, no, you can't change. This is what you planned for. And so I'm glad you clarified that we do have, hopefully we'll have flexibility and some local control over that to be flexible. And I think it's a point with these dormant lands to bring up is, Mr. Versick brought up a good point about, folks that have grazing land or undeveloped lands that are inside of these basins. What sort of pathway do they have if there's a sustainable number out there that's fairly firm? Let's say, we're pretty confident in it. And then as we approach that limit, how do we deal with that? And I think that's, I think one of the key things we'll probably have to discuss in these allocation meetings is how do we accommodate some flexibility there for, I guess the term is dormant lands. I think of it as just pasture land and land in the basin that hasn't been developed. So it's not really a question. Don't worry about it. I just,
It's a good point, Mr. Leip. And in our conversations in sub-basins, different sub-basins are taking different approaches to it. But you're absolutely right. It's one of the key questions in this allocation. And I do hope that people who are at this meeting and listening in are taking it seriously, because it is an important question in what the availability of water might be.
well, yeah, and we're talking about being equitable with this stuff, and
Yes.
and it's, you know, it's not the landowner's fault that they have chosen not to do anything with their land, but if they're in the basin and they want to do something with their land, you know, there should be a way to fit that in. And I appreciate the commenters, both Mr. Smith and Mr. Versick, about, you know, trying to figure this out. And I know it was discussed at our allocation meeting. I suspect it'll be discussed at our next allocation meeting when it happens. The other point I wanted to just talk about real quick was, you talked about, you know, sort of, you know, I appreciate we're on this hamster wheel, and we have so much more time left before the hamster wheel blows up. And so we're using the two models that are available to us. Could you foresee a point in time where maybe the GSA says, you know, we really want to do a holistic approach and be able to focus on ideas and concepts that we have as an agency to develop our own model, or have multiple models and have, so that we can kind of get a peer check, you know, check for check, make sure we're getting different perspectives on the same thing instead of just one view of it?
Maybe that, I mean, I'm happy to answer that. It sounds like that's an agency question.
Thanks, Donna.
Yes, Donna, thank you.
I think, you know, I think that, Bill, I think, you know, we're at the very beginning of a 20-year process to really understand how to get to sustainability and a mix of management actions and projects and other things. I think that at this point, you know, there's value in trying to work with our partners with these models because of the various basin things that are going on that may or may not be related to groundwater. So I think that there is importance to trying to participate as a cooperative partner on some of these. But at this point, I mean, of course, our board would make the final determination on this. At least from our planning processes, we'll be looking at this set of models.
No, I appreciate that. I don't want to be, you know, building duplicate wheels all over the place. It's just, you know, I kind of come from software, a little bit of a software background, and, you know, basically it's competing ideas, and more sets of eyeballs is better than less. But that, you know, so that's just, but I can totally appreciate that. I think based on some of the comments that others have made about, and I'm thinking of committee member Smith's question about, you know, locking us in, you know, people have a history of, you know, you vote for something, or you assess yourself something, and then you kind of get locked in, and then it's like, oh, wait a second, things have changed, you know. And I'm not just being specific about water. I'm just, you know, you kind of commit to something, and then, you know, 20 years down, as you said, 20 years down the road, maybe none of us are here, and people are saying, well, this is what they said they wanted to do, and so we're going to carry it forward forever. But I think you've clarified it today, and hopefully others are hearing it too, is that we have the ability to be flexible here going forward. At least we hope so, with our other partners at DWR and elsewhere that are regulating us, I guess, in a sense, with the approving these plans. So it's a good discussion, and I think you know, there'll be more to come, and hopefully we'll all be here. I hope we're all here in 20 years. I really do.
Yeah, I think that, you know, I mean, we're using the model to really kind of, you know, both as a diagnostics tool, but also as a planning tool. And I think that we, you know, as the technology around these models, I mean, my understanding of these models is they are incredibly complex, and between the verification, obviously the review, the scientific review, the technical review, all the things. I mean, these things take a lot of time to build. And I think that, you know, it behooves us to be patient with the process and work with the product before we sort of, you know, toss it aside and start to go to something else. I think consistency for the agency is going to be very important. We have annual reporting. We're going to be making adjustments in these GSPs every 5 years. So, moving back and forth between different models, it may not serve us. It may seem like a good idea, but it may not serve us in the long term as a good approach. And but again, these are just my reflections.
No, I'm a realist. I realize that we're on the track we're on. I like to hear how, as committee member Smith had asked, are we locking ourselves into anything here? And I don't believe we are. So I'm glad that you clarified that. I know the mission we've taken on here is 12 months out. So
yeah, and I think I readily admit that we have to rely on our team here. Stefan is a really capable modeler, and I think he's very capable in terms of really trying to get out of this resource what it is that we need to answer our questions. And I think that that's the piece that I feel confident that we're getting, that we are getting served that way by using this tool right now. There may be something different that we want to do or look at in the future, but I think for our purposes right now, I think we're still on track. So I appreciate your questions, Bill.
Next, we have committee member Kramers.
Thanks. Hey, I guess my question is maybe more to Derek than anyone is, I don't feel like we're locked into anything, but certainly how quickly could we change something? I mean, if we have to have our GSPs in and then we have more information, quasi immediately, do we have to wait 5 years before we can update and change anything, or can we change something sooner than that?
Good question, Mr. Kramers. That's actually a question that people are looking at right now. We're working in another area where they're trying to change their GSP just to get a project in it so they can get funding for it in the next grant round. They're just trying to say, by fiat, we're putting this in our GSP today. I don't know if that is what you can do. However, we have heard recently from DWR that minor changes, we might not have to submit a whole new GSP. We might just have to submit a memo or something. The point is, it is still a question that's in flux. I know you don't have to wait every 5 years to change your GSP, but what the process is still in flux there. And that's probably the best I can tell you, because people are trying to do it right now, and it turns out there's not a clear path for what has to be done.
Okay. And then is it appropriate to call out these items that we think we're lacking clarity on the front end of the GSP when we submit it?
Let me put it this way. It is appropriate to say, we know that there is uncertainty in this GSP, and we are going to address that uncertainty, and we plan on changing the GSP in the future, because that lets DWR, that lets both the stakeholders know that we're going to address some things that there might be concerns about, and we lets DWR know also that we know that we want to make some changes.
And quite honestly, if a sub-basin were to say its sustainable groundwater yield is 100,000 acre feet, let's say, and we go through this and now we know that it's 175,000 acre feet, is that really honestly going to change, you think?
Is that going to change what, our approach, or is that going to change the GSP?
Would it change at some point in the GSP to the benefit of the users in the basin? I mean, are we locked in?
No, if we change that number, it does change. That's probably, we'd like to set up these GSPs so if we think we have a better sustainable yield, we can take advantage of that as soon as possible. Okay. If the sustainable yield goes from 100 to 175, we want to take advantage of that quickly, which is why we write these GSPs to say we will pump within the sustainable yield, and right now this is our best estimate of it. Okay. But sticking to that number isn't the key point. Sticking to we are pumping within the sustainable yield is the key policy there.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not a criteria, Grant, as much as as much as a framework. We're not
right.
different than, like, for example, water quality. You got to meet this criteria. You got to meet this, this measurable, you got to meet this number. We're more in that global, more, we're operating under a management regime, I guess, or a method of management towards that, but we're not tied right to that number. It's not
Okay.
a numeric management system.
And then my final comment is the dormant user, and I think that's definitely an Upper Valley issue. I mean, if you just look at the basins themselves. I mean, there's not a lot of dormant users in some of the other sub basins. There's maybe a couple streets that don't have irrigation systems, but that's about it. But I think it's an Upper Valley issue, and I think everyone's pretty aware of it, and I think that is something that we do need to figure out how to manage, because things change. But the other thing is land use changes quite a bit quickly. I mean, it would be interesting to see what the extraction numbers are for last year, because I mean, I think there was a lot less rotation on ground last year, and certainly there's a lot of grapes that are knocked out and so forth. And so things do change quickly here. At some point, groundwater is a little bit like a bank account. If you don't pump the water this year, it is in theory there next year.
When I would add in, Grant, to your point, right, that as we saw our Jim's presentation at the Water Resources Board, I mean, we've shown with the use of drip and rotation of crops, things pulling out, we actually have been using the same or less water in ag specifically over. I mean, that's just how it's been trending, and of course we're doing more with that. This is a whole other thing in the world of telling our story in ag a little better, since we're the big users, but we're also the biggest conservationists, because we know what the resource is and how important it is. So I just think, again, with 60 people on here that aren't all ag and whatever, it's important to point that out. And we're not making this up, right? This is stuff that's coming from the Water Resources Agency, and what's being reported, and who's using drip, and how we're using it. And we just, we need to continue that, and continue to be able to, like you said, bank what we can while we can, and plan for the future. So no more soapbox.
Was that everything, Grant? Okay. Committee member Mosquito.
Yes, I have a question. Does the model provide information on the amount of water that is flowing out to the ocean and from the Salinas River and other streams, especially when we have heavy rains, like the year 19? This year, I don't think the river has any water, but are we going to get some of that information on how much water is going out to the ocean?
We do on the model. It does have a precipitation element that falls onto the ground, and then it has a runoff component that goes into. So, and the model tracks surface water flows along the Salinas River, or any surface water that flows into the to the ocean. So we track that, and we track the groundwater movement from the inland towards the ocean. So we do track all of that, the water.
Thank you.
Next we have Marika Desmond again.
Yeah, sorry to ask another question, but great questions coming up. I'm curious about, not just how quickly we can change the GSP, but also how you could update data in the model. So whether it's, verification of water use. I know we talked about static data from 2014 land use, but obviously if land use has changed since 2014, if we're able to verify that a certain amount of water has in fact been pumped, are those easy to incorporate into a model? And then secondly, when Derek was talking about some of the risks or the challenges of using a preliminary model, are there specific pieces you're expecting to change in this from the preliminary to the final model? Are you already anticipating some of those areas? I'd be curious to hear just a little bit more both those fronts. Thank you.
Two questions. So as far as are there specific areas, we are looking at the model now, but I don't think we've identified anything saying, oh, we know this is going to change going forward. The USGS has told us they are continuing to update the model, but they don't tell us the specifics about it. So I'm sorry, I can't give you much information about that. The first question about the effort to update. There is an effort. I know that the USGS and the Water Resource Agency would like to get to a place where the updating is relatively automatic. As someone who has run models for many decades, it's usually not that easy to update models that easily. My advice always is update the model when you think it is going to either change the model results significantly so you can get a better idea of where you're going, or it would, even more importantly, it would change your decision. If it's just an update to say, let's get more data in there, sometimes it's not worth it, but you do want to update it regularly every few years, just so you don't get behind on the data. And you do want to update it if there's a big change, as you were pointing out, if there was a big change in land use and it might change your decision because there's a big change in land use, you want to update it then. So that's a couple things every few years, or if there's a big change. But that said, I have never seen a model where updating and incorporating new data is fairly automatic. It always causes a few questions and concerns. So because of that, I always suggest to clients they don't try and update on a extremely regular basis, because sometimes you just end up putting out more effort than is really needed. Hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Yes.
I'm not seeing any other hands raised at the moment.
If I could add one thing about moving forward. We've mentioned that we'll have another model workshop, one much more in depth. And we know that this is frustrating not to have the model in your hand. And so we do have Stefan and a team of modelers reviewing this. MCWRA is working on this. We are planning to bring in the USGS for that workshop. And to the extent that we can, we'd like to help you understand the model. And so if you have certain questions about it, Emily, I guess we'll probably set up some process by which we can figure out what you're interested in prior to that meeting and best help you, get that information for you.
Yeah, when we'll send out, we can send out an email to all of our interested stakeholders, suggesting that they reach out to us with questions. But because you're all here, please email us with any specific questions that you have after this workshop, and we'll do our best to tackle them at the next one. So we've got a lot of good questions so far, and but if anything else comes up, we're happy to address it next time. And once we land on the date, we'll also announce that it'll be sometime later March, maybe early April is what we're thinking now. And as soon as we land on the date, we'll send out an announcement. So with that, a huge thank you to Stefan. It was a wonderful presentation. And thank you to all the Sub-Basin Committee members and members of the public for great participation. Makes workshops like this really, really great to have such good dialogue. So, and thank you, Abby, for providing wonderful context. And with that, we'll just go through the rest of our agenda because we are officially having a meeting, or 4, I guess, of the different Sub-Basin committees. And General Manager status report. Donna, do you have anything to add?
I do not have anything to report on today.
Okay. And so I think it's okay to just go ahead and adjourn the meeting then. Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.